There was this combination of introspection and reflection with another person who's doing the same thing, so kind of has that same buy-in.
Hmm.
That yeah, I think like a lot of people could get something out of. So this idea of personal information architecture has been something that for years I've thought about and kind of dreamt about, like this world of unlocking information architecture from purely professional endeavors. And I think like there's nothing more important than making sense of yourself. Like,
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Edit Undo podcast. My name is Alfi and we are joined with my co-host Stephanie. And today we get to introduce you to a very special guest. Friend, collaborator, and colleague of mine, Abby Covert is an information architect, writer, and community organizer with 2 decades of experience helping people make sense of messes. Apart from sharing her work on stage at more than 20 different conferences, she has also served the design community as president of the Information Architecture Institute and co chair of Information Architecture Summit, as well as executive producer of the IDEA conference. Abby has written 2 popular books, How to Make Sense of Any Mess and Stuck Diagramming Helps. She currently spends her time making things that help make the unclear clear, many of which are made freely available at her website, abbycovert.com, or at an accessible price point at her Etsy shop, Abby the IA. In 2022, she started the Sensemakers Club, where she brings together sensemakers from different walks of life to learn from one another. Abby currently lives and writes from Melbourne, Florida, where her most important job title is mom. And with no further ado, let's dive into the episode.
From all the things that Alfie read there, it almost immediately sounds like you're almost like a therapist making sense of things, but for creatives in some way, right?
totally. Oh my gosh, Stephanie,
Mhm.
I would say that that is a name that I have been given in the past, usually by people I am actually working
Really?
with. Yeah, I've been called an information therapist several times. I feel like that's a really
Wow.
good way to describe it because so much of the
Hmm.
mess is kind of confronting it at the beginning, and that's the
Yeah.
Mhm.
scariest part for a lot of people. So yeah, there's a lot of like
Mhm.
talking people through the hardest part of confronting it, which I think has a lot of overlap with therapy. So yeah, I
Mhm.
think you
Yeah.
read that right.
Yeah.
And
Nice.
I think one of the things that I kind of want to add, and one of the contributions that I think your work has sort of really had an effect on, is focusing specifically on making information architecture accessible. And I think
Mhm.
I'm a little bit more interested in the part about making it accessible than the actual information architect. I think you've done a lot of
Yeah.
work in the space and contributed quite a lot. But I think it's at least from what I've experienced of your community so far and what an outsider might see looking in, it's probably a little bit different working at educating people who are entering an industry for the first time and
Mhm.
kind of establishing what their journey is going to be versus working with people who are already practitioners and are
Mhm.
looking to improve their knowledge in a specific space.
Yeah.
And I'd be interested to hear a little bit about like how you've sort of found that shift going from a practicing information architect to kind of looking at supporting other people practicing in the space.
Yeah. I feel like the kind of the thesis of my work is that information architecture is for everybody. And I try to sort of view all of my work through that lens. And so I do run into a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people that are, related to the camps that you just described. I have people that are newer to a field that are finding information architecture as sort of this organizing framework, a
Mm-hmm.
more like supercharged version of whatever they're doing later in their career path that have been doing this whole time and they didn't know what to call it. Jobs to specialize in. They've never known that there's articles and books to read about it to get better at it. And I think that, like,
Mm-hmm.
in both of those cases, one of the most fundamental parts of information architecture becomes true about it, which is that language really matters. And when you don't have a label for a thing, it is not as findable. And I really do believe that it's a human skill set that needs to be accessible
Mm-hmm.
to as many people as possible because it's something we do all day, every day. I'm not teaching people about categories. Like, you learn that in like pre-K. literally.
Mm-hmm.
But I am pointing out that categories done without thoughtful attention can be really harmful to your business intention, your
Mm-hmm.
personal intention, whatever it is. So I feel like a lot of the things about information architecture are sort of the basics of being a communicator, but it's
Mm-hmm.
taken through a framework that people can actually look at themselves as an IA and say, am I doing a good job at this or not? And start to see
Yeah.
how their role in information can get in the way, because a lot of times it is.
Definitely, definitely. And there's an interesting thing that you wrote about recently, which I'd like us to maybe start like laying the foundation of the conversation. It's this idea of from what you're describing, one of the main parts of the work is around communication, and
Mm-hmm.
often the communication work that we're doing in an organization is focused around trying to create change of some kind, whether it's to
Yeah.
improve a specific element, to make something more accessible, to improve the flow of a specific journey,
Mm-hmm.
but we can often hit our head against the perfectionism wall. Can you share a little bit
Yes.
about some of the things that you've been sort of finding as you're working with the students that you're
Yeah.
working with, and just some of the
Yeah.
things that you've been writing about recently?
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the blessings of this year for me has been this program I started in November last year called The Practitioner's Guide to How to Make Sense of Any Mess. And it was an invitation to a reader who really wanted to put IA into practice to come with me along on this 7-week journey where they're reading the book and then they're getting this bonus content and templates along the way, so they can kind of make sense of their mess as they're reading it. Now, one of the small features that I added was this ability to dial in for office hours and ask questions. But after 11 months of having these office hours, I'm starting to find out they don't have questions about the book. They don't have questions about information architecture. They have questions about change and people. Like that is what they want to talk about. And so I really started
Mm-hmm.
to have that influence my own writing. One of the things that I am really proud of identifying in myself is that I come from a perfectionist background, and I've really had to work on that about myself, to not constantly judge myself against an impossible standard. And I started to
Mm-hmm.
see that in the questions that my students were asking. They would say things like, oh, I came into this organization and, it's a 50-year-old organization with, thousands of people working there and this gigantic mess of a library. And I just want to make sense of it because it's such a mess. And I'm like, is that your job to do? Is that a thing that you have been incentivized to do? And they're like, no, but it's such a
Mm-hmm.
mess. It's in the way. And I'm just like, yeah, I get that. But if the incentives aren't aligned, there's no way you're actually going to get that thing done. And I think that in a lot of cases, the things that I'm seeing, the questions people ask is about change. And the thing that's standing in the way of change is that they have kind of this misalignment with their stakeholders about what it is the value is of the thing that they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to sell it for it's better for users, but you get it to a certain level of stakeholder and you no longer get support for it's better for users. You only get support for it moves this needle in this direction. And better for users
Yeah.
actually isn't a needle. You really, it's very, very difficult to measure that. So yeah, I find that the more time I spend with real people making sense of real messes, which is very different than consulting, right? In consulting, you're making sense of other people's messes. In this
Mm-hmm.
format, I am meeting with people who are making sense of their own messes, and I'm just hearing the hardest parts of it. And I was surprised how much of it is telling them that you don't have to get to that perfect place. You don't have to work in a place where there are no messes to feel like you're
Mm-hmm.
any good at this, because there's always going to be messes. As soon as you figure out the
Yeah.
ones you have, there's going to be new ones. So yeah,
Mm.
I feel like I've learned a lot about myself, but also just about like, I don't know, the false promise of information architecture is that everything can be this like perfectly structured, perfectly efficient thing. And I don't believe that that's
Yeah.
actually true. So yeah, I think
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
it's important to get that word out to people because they get the wrong message. They start to think that it's like them. They couldn't sell it. They couldn't get it done. They couldn't convince
Mm-hmm.
people, whatever it is. When really it's just like, no, it's an impossible task. You don't have the right incentive architecture right now to do the information architecture, which I think is an interesting thing people need to be either
Aware of.
taught or reminded of. Because a lot of times it's
Yeah.
like, oh, you're right. I've had that happen before. But it's almost like people need to be reminded of that in context to the thing they're doing right now.
Can you
Mhm.
maybe, I don't know if there is someone you've worked with in the past that you can disclose one of those actual projects or examples? Because I think, especially for the people who aren't quite familiar with IA or even just the concept of sense making, they might
Yeah,
be wondering what you mean by making sense of a mess, what that mess
absolutely.
can
Mhm.
be in a like a practical sense, and
Yeah,
kind of what do you actually do when you kind of work with them to make sense of
yeah,
it? Is it like what exercises do you do with them? And yeah.
sure. Okay, so I'm going to use two very different examples, and then I'm going to tell you the same
Mm-hmm.
process for both.
Okay.
Mhm.
One is a small system of microsites to support
Mm-hmm.
an ashram in India. And the
Mm-hmm.
other is
Mhm.
a 96-week sales process for $1 billion company called Nike. Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
the thing that those two things have in common is that both of them came to me with a complete mess on their hands, which was they had a very sprawling thing and they had no picture of the sprawling thing they had. So they couldn't impact change on the thing. So Nike had this 96-week process that had thousands of people working internally via that process and had for years, but it was kind of held together with the communication of emails and file servers and things like that. They were completely losing the opportunity for all of the data that was being collected there
Mhm.
to make the sales process in the future be more efficient, be more data driven. And so they saw that as an opportunity, but getting from the opportunity to actually being able to build a
Mhm.
software suite that supports that, the part in the middle is the information architecture. It's the figuring out what are the actual pieces of the thing, what are the labels that different versions of the audience for this thing give to that thing, and how does that thing connect to all of the other things. And a lot of
Yeah.
times that comes out in things like diagrams, maps,
Mm.
controlled vocabulary documents, things like that. So on a project as large as a 96-week process map for Nike. That took me 9 months. I had an entire creative
Yeah.
team. It was to support a over 100-person engineering and design team that was going to be building off of it. So that was like a very large version of it. But
Yeah.
with the ashram, that was like 2 monks, me and 2 monks on a Zoom call, and some PDFs flying back and forth, and
Mhm.
it was just some diagrams, but they're the same thing. I made the same basic deliverables for both of those situations. So I think when I say how to make sense of any mess, I'm pretty staunch on that any word. Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
It.
it requires a robust process to be able to sort
Yeah.
of back kind of
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
approach.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
I am
sorry,
quite
Steph, I think I
interested.
into
Yeah,
Mhm.
you punted on the word the fact that it can be any mess. So for me,
Mm-hmm.
the most obvious example is obviously a lot of corporations, teams work in silos. The
Mm-hmm.
information is held in those spaces, which sounds like working with them. The value you bring is kind of like an overarching transparency and
Mm-hmm.
bringing together those silos and understanding what informations they hold and how they
Yeah.
cross pollinate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if if the mess can be any mess, does
Mm-hmm.
your process when you work with them change, or like the methodology, or does
Hmm.
it depend on the mess that you're solving?
It absolutely
Or not
depends on.
solving, but
Yeah, yeah, definitely
unmessing,
not
sense
solving.
making.
Yeah, making sense of.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely not a solve for sure. I would say that the process is similar in that I follow the rough steps of a
Mm-hmm.
process, but I would say that the deliverables are always fairly unique to whatever the mess is.
Mm. Yeah.
And I find that to be the same with my students. Like now that I'm not practicing as much myself, but I'm more guiding students, what I'm seeing is that they're approaching similar messes, but because they're in very different contexts, they might approach them
Yeah.
very
Mhm.
Yeah.
differently. And so I think at this point, one of the things I'm the most interested in is sort of teaching people the grammar so that they can make up their own deliverable parts so that it really makes sense for their context, as opposed to like
Mhm.
trying to sell them a toolkit where they need to use a
Yeah.
subset of this superset to like do it right. And I
Yeah.
think that there's a lot of value for people in templates, but I think there's also a little bit of danger in them that if you try to
Yeah.
apply templates to the word any in that, it doesn't really work all that often. Yeah.
Yeah. You know what
Mhm.
I'm curious about is, and I think there's a lot of industries, including the one Alfie was in and I'm still currently in, which
Mm-hmm.
is what you said is you don't necessarily know when you start looking at a mess or a project objective what the outcome or output will be. And
Yeah.
a lot of times that's quite hard to sell your
Mm-hmm.
skill sets or sell what you're trying to do, especially if you're a consultant. And
Yeah.
I'm very curious, like, what is your approach? Like, how do you sell yourself then
Yeah.
to this organization who's extremely output focused, usually not outcome focused, if you
Mm.
yourself don't really know what the outcome will look like or
Yeah.
be?
So this is the thing. I think like knowing what the outcome will be.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the outcome of working with an information architect will be clarity. I know that
Okay.
the outcome will
Mm.
be a direction forward. And I know that then something will be momentum, right? Like those three
Okay.
things I
Mm.
can promise. Knowing is
Yeah.
it going to be an app with this many
Yeah.
screens that has this much architecture behind it, that has this much database needs? No, that part is really hard to get up front. So I find that
Yeah.
one of the most important things is to understand that scoping is part of what you're laying out in the process. Um,
Mm.
and also to be really careful about expertise. Like I think when you oversell your expertise at the beginning by promising something that you're projecting into like a massive void,
Yeah.
you're setting yourself up for later on when you don't know the
Mm-hmm.
answer to something and now you're supposed to be the expert. Why don't you know the answer to this? Versus if you go in as like, I'm not an expert in your mess. I've never been in your mess before. I'm an expert in
Mm-hmm.
making sense of messes. That's a different.
Mm-hmm.
You have to teach me about your mess. I don't know enough about your mess to make sense of it. Like, whoa, you operate in an entire different country? I didn't even know that. Like, I take that tact more often. And I really encourage my students to do that as well, to sort of keep
Mm.
focused on that discovery process up front
Mm-hmm.
that really is about discovering and not about going through some slides showing what we're going to do, which I think a lot of people are using discovery for right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not about
Mm-hmm.
like telling them what they're going to get at the end. Although I will say that
It's the
oftentimes
value.
people are telling me what they're going to get at the end. You know, like I worked with the International House of Pancakes. Like I knew what I was going to give them at the
Mm-hmm.
end because I needed a new menu. Like that's not going to
Okay.
change, but what's going to be on that menu and what it's going to take to
Yeah.
get there, that's a little bit more malleable based on, you know, the process and the
Mm-hmm.
objectives and the resources.
Mm.
You know, I ate a lot of pancakes on that project, but I didn't eat
Mm-hmm.
enough pancakes with other people at certain parts of it. I had to like scale that back.
Mm-hmm.
It's
And
the only project
you
I
know,
ever had a pancake budget on, by the way.
I think the world would be a better place with more pancake budgets.
Mm, that was a great project. Very fun.
Yeah, I can imagine. You know, one of the things that has been, I think, the most interesting for me, and I think you touched on, it a little bit earlier in this conversation, is this idea of having students who are in
Mm-hmm.
like a diverse range of places, because you
Yeah.
know, I think a lot of the communication or engagements that we have, for the time being, maybe in a professional context, are people who you either work with, or they are
Mm-hmm.
people in your your personal life and your family. But there
Yeah.
are very few relationships you have with people who are not family or friends that are in
Mm-hmm.
the same profession as you. And so
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to hear a little bit of what you found in terms of the dynamic of having people from different organizations in
Mm.
the same level, in the same discipline of practice,
Yeah.
collaborating or working on the same on the same problems.
Yeah. I've definitely found there's a lot of like emoji reacts of like hands and like a lot of shaking
Mm,
heads when there's people talking, and that I feel like it makes people feel really seen. Like I think that
mm,
oftentimes a reaction I get, especially to office hours, is somebody comes the first time and they're not really sure that they're even going to ask a question, but then they do ask a question and they leave having so much more insight in the fact that this is not unique, that I think gives them a lot of permission to kind of like let themselves off the hook a little bit. Like this is just,
No.
mm-hmm,
it's just information architecture. You know, we're not doing surgery here. And I think that
mm-hmm,
that's something that a lot of people need to be reminded of, because the environment that they're working in can sometimes feel very different from that for all sorts of power dynamic reasons. So I do find this like routine of having these people come together once a month for an hour to just talk about what they're working on and ask questions that are super high level. They're not like showing us deliverables or anything like that. It's more, you know, I'm dealing with this particular stakeholder in this way, or I'm tackling this project. Has anybody else tackled something like this? And yeah, people feel very like seen, I think. I know I do. I mean, I'm continually every month, I'm just like, man, this really is a thing. Like people really do this all day long, and none of their titles is information architect. Like all of them are doing something else, but they all have to do this thing called information architecture, and they all found this random place that I created on the internet to put people together and talk about that. It's wild.
Yeah, I think it's a space that I'm also just interested in because, I can remember when I was working, when Steph and I first met, we met at a bank on this side called ABSA. And so one of so we were both working on the banking app, and I was like, one of my focuses was around the design system. And at least in South Africa, like, a lot of companies were sort of in the early stages of doing design systems, and was a concept that was somewhat new, especially what I think while I was working it. So a lot of people knew about it, but not many people had sort of delivered a complete one. And I can just remember wishing to have people who are struggling with the same problem as me to talk to, just to compare notes, just to kind of see like, am I going completely in the wrong direction, or are we walking down the same path and just don't know it? And I think there's something to be said for building community outside our typical work boundaries with people who are just focused or interested in the same thing as us. And maybe that in some sense is a foreshadowing of how you and I started initially working together.
Yeah, totally.
It's
meeting on a spreadsheet. Have you ever met a person via spreadsheet? Because it's really worth doing at least once in your life.
That does not sound like Alfi though at all.
Oh my gosh. I totally met Alfi via spreadsheet. Yeah.
Oh, that's bizarre.
Although on the one hand, Steph, like there are very few things I wouldn't do to find people to meet and people to talk to. So finding me in a spreadsheet is maybe not the place where I commonly am, but where there are people, you can find me.
Man, I should go back and look at the initial spreadsheet row of you and see what you said, because I don't even remember at this point what you said.
Ooh, I hesitate to think what past Alfi was getting up to.
We won't read it on air. How about that?
Cool. We can laugh about it offline.
Yeah, I'll send it to you later.
But yeah, so I think... So, sorry, Steph, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
No, I think I was just going to provide a little bit of context around, how you and I initially started working together, because I think there's an element of collaboration that I'm interested in. We've talked a little bit around some of the students that you might have this experience of meeting kindred spirits. But then sometimes you also just meet a person who, in some sense, it isn't clear what the kinship is. And I think in some way that was very much the case with you and I. I, for the first time, spoke at Make Sense Miss 2022, which is coming around. Which by the time you're hearing this will already have been published and done.
That's fun. Let's pretend that we're in the future
for
the rest of the conversation. Yay.
But I think why I wanted to bring that up is because when you and I initially started having our conversations, it wasn't very clear what the end goal was. And, Steph, kind of considering the question that you asked, like, we came into the initial conversations very much without clear understanding of what the outcome would be. But I think, in a sense, we had a shared interest in some of the concepts and ideas we were talking about. Yeah. And I think I'm glad for where it's brought us, because I think there's a lot in the works that's coming.
Yeah, I feel like there was one like term that both of us were really interested in at the same time, and working out that one term and what that would mean to teach to other people has basically taken us a year. So should we tell them what the term is?
Yes, please.
The term is peer mentorship. I think that like when Alfi and I connected, I was at a really unique place where I had finished my second book, and I knew that I wanted to do more in the world of content creation. And I had this Sensemakers Club idea, and I knew I wanted to do something there, but I wasn't really sure like what that looked like. I knew how to make an e-course, and I knew how to like, make something based on the books that I have and that kind of thing. And then Alfi was in a unique position himself, but I'll let him speak to that. And we sort of like came into this world where we're both talking with one another and we're in very different places, yet we're bouncing things off of one another. And it was this really, I felt like really important kind of like mooring. You know, we just had like this weekly meeting while we were trying to figure out like, oh, we're going to do something together. Maybe eventually let's just hang out. And over time it started to be like oh man, I'm really getting a lot of value from this idea of only knowing this person through this lens of like growing as practitioners, as entrepreneurs, as people. And yeah, we started to get really interested in doing that. Alfie, do you want to take the next chapter of kind of like what happened?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, you know, as you mentioned on my side, I was really focused on this concept of peer mentorship, like the possibility of two people at equal levels coming together to in a sort of give and take. And I think, you know, at first, I think when we were chatting, I was just kind of chasing this idea down, like, you know, super focused. And then I started to realize like every time we're having that conversation, we were practicing the thing that I was chasing down. You know, we were kind of going through this process where you share a little bit of your ideas, I share a little bit of where I'm thinking, and we kind of come together in the middle to find something that's, you know, of value to both of us. And so, you know, as we kind of worked on it, more and more, I think we started to see that there's just as much value in the collaboration on this course than in the material that we were actually working on. And so, you know, it kind of went from just a weekly catch up of just ideas being thrown around to actually seriously wanting to create something that could sort of repeat what you and I were working together on organically. It kind of took us, and I still remember eventually realizing, you know, we were kind of going through focusing a lot on the mentorship element of things. And more I realized for me to do this effectively, I need to have answers about myself that I don't yet have. And I kind of need to look internally and get to know myself a little bit better so that the give and take could actually be genuine. Because, you know, it's easy to say that you're getting into a give and take. But if you don't know what you're giving and you don't know what you're taking, it's only a matter of time until things sort of get imbalanced. And so we kind of started looking into different ways of helping a person go through the process of generating a little bit more self-awareness. I'm not at all saying that we've got, you know, a solve all solution, but I think it's a lot more focused on the foundations of that. And I think that eventually, you know, evolved into one of the projects that you and I are going to be, you know, launching together very soon. It's also been, I think, a huge learning experience for me, kind of stepping into this role of educator. You know, I think our audience is already pretty familiar with my my struggle with academia, and eventually, so, you know, overcoming that and now sort of coming full circle to kind of enter at a different point has been definitely a huge growing experience for me. And I think in some ways, you know, I think that kind of story we've been kind of going down, it's pretty much led to, I think, where we are today at the edge of kind of bringing this thing into the world.
Yeah. So, I mean, for real, we're bringing into this thing into the world. Our application process for our course is now open in this future world that we're speaking in this podcast. And I hope that that's true. My goodness, I really hope that that's the case. And yeah, we created a course called Making Sense of Yourself. And I think like the thing that I was really surprised by was I didn't think I knew myself for sure. I didn't. But I thought that I knew myself pretty well professionally. I think like that was a little surprising to me, that when I started to really get into conversations with somebody specifically about areas that I want to see myself grow in, I was surprised by my weaknesses. I was surprised by the things that Alfie was able to see that I wasn't able to see. And I felt like there was this combination of introspection and reflection with another person who's doing the same thing, so kind of has that same buy-in. But yeah, I think like a lot of people could get something out of. So this idea of personal information architecture has been something that for years I've thought about and kind of dreamt about, like this world of unlocking information architecture from purely professional endeavors. And I think like there's nothing more important than making sense of yourself. Like it just impacts every mentorship relationship, every job you're going to go after, every relationship you're going to be in. And so, yeah, I think, you know, similar to Alfie, I'm kind of like, we don't know exactly what we're doing here. We're doing this for the first time, but Yeah, I think the tools that we've developed are really thoughtful. And
Mm-hmm.
I can definitely say we've tested the heck out of them on ourselves, if no one else. So
Yeah.
we've also tested them
Sure.
on other people.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
You know, as an outsider kind of listening and with not too much more context than what you guys shared here now around this concept of peer mentorship that you guys been kind of working
Mm-hmm.
through and figuring out, I can immediately feel and see the value for. I'm going to take myself as an example, and because I think a lot of people might think, but where's the value in that, or am I the right person to kind of do this course
Mm-hmm.
or go on this journey
Mhm.
with you guys? And as a designer in a company, and this is a very common use case, often a design practitioner of any sort of design, there is a quite a responsibility to bring different people, different things together, make sure
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
there is some equilibrium, some um, yeah, just some synergy between different spaces. For instance, I often work with the data team, I work with the marketing team,
Mhm.
I work with the content team, I work with the country managers, I
Yeah.
work with the supply team. And for instance, I have the scenario now where we have a marketing design division and I work for the product team. And we have often set up this meeting, myself and the designer within the marketing team, and we have this recurring meeting once a month, and we don't really have an agenda for the meeting. And it's been actually quite
Mhm.
hard to commit to that meeting because we feel like beforehand, if we don't have a concrete agenda or a plan on
Mm.
how we're going to
Mm-hmm.
align these two spaces, that we don't
Yeah.
necessarily see value in us keeping that meeting. But this
Yeah.
is
Mm-hmm.
quite a like concrete example that you guys explained, where kind of just figuring out where are the similarities by just conversing,
Yes.
and
Mm-hmm.
the non-similarities, the differences, and where we have shared values, our values align, and where
Mhm.
they don't, and just kind of allowing that process to unfold without having some concrete goal or agenda in mind
Yeah.
is very
Mm-hmm.
key and part of the process as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's very important too, like going into that. I would say, like, if you wanted to start an official peer mentorship with that person, like, you would have to know a lot about what you want in order to do that.
Yeah.
And they would have to know a lot about what they want. And I think, like, that's where Alfie and I got to is like,
Mm-hmm.
we were for months, I mean, probably about 6 months, honestly, of this process,
Mm-hmm.
we were designing a course on peer mentorship. And that's what the course
Mm-hmm.
was on. And we kept being like, okay, if we're going to pair people up, we have to they have to get to know one another, and so it would be like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
so let's give them a tool so that they can get to know each other. But then we figured out, oh no, in order to get to know each other, they have to know themselves so that they can actually
Mm-hmm.
present themselves to a stranger, in this case. So
Mm.
that's where everything kind of backed up, which we were like, oh my gosh, in order to do a course on peer mentorship, we actually have to do an entire course on just figuring yourself out. So now we
Mm-hmm.
have a 3 month course, half of which is figuring out yourself, and half of which is pairing up with a stranger and going through the rest
Yeah.
of the journey of sort of, figuring out what your path going forward is. So it's interesting that it sort of, yeah, everything kind of reflected the process that we went through, all the way down to the like, oh yeah, we're actually thinking about making sense of ourselves. This isn't even about peer mentorship yet. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it's definitely been a crazy journey. But I think one of the things that's surprising for me is the personal growth that has resulted, and some of the things I think that I had to
same.
kind of face or contend with as a result. Because sort of knowing that this is something that you want to stand behind, you want to
Mm-hmm.
ensure that you're also coming at the process honestly and truthfully. And I think we had
Yeah.
to have quite a number of conversations that were definitely vulnerable. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
one of the elements that you kind of sort of need, especially at and when you have two people who are at an equal level coming to each other. And I think one of the things that I'm sort of picking out from the last couple of things that have been identified is sort of ensuring that the energy exchange is somewhat equal. And I think one of the
Yeah.
interesting things you and I found along the way is that often some of relationships that somewhat start off with a power dynamic, let's say a manager and a direct report, eventually graduate into a peer mentorship, because that person isn't going to be a junior forever.
Yeah.
And eventually they'll pick up the skills, they'll kind of become more competent until the stage where this person is just as much on the forefront as you. And and especially when I'm thinking about people who are either thought leaders or people who are on the edge of their industry, maybe relationships like that are even more valuable, just because in some sense, you've climbed a specific skill set so far that there are maybe not as many people who you can look to as in the traditional mentorship sense. I don't know. Maybe Abby, I don't know if you've found in your experience, like, have there been people along the way, as you've been developing your own personal growth and your own work, like people who you might consider to be peers who also have that mentorship relationship before we even started, working on this concept together?
Yeah, no, I would say that like literally my entire career is because of mentorship. Like every move that I've made could be directly attributable to a person or group of people that have guided me. I have been really of benefit to the fact that I am like the second wave of information architecture. And the first wave is all people that I have had the opportunity to meet and know, many of whom have taken personal interest in me as I've been coming up, and I've known them since I was like in my mid-20s. So some of them I've known for 20 years. So yeah, it's been really interesting. Like it has gone the way that you just described. Like I was recently talking to somebody in that group who's kind of like in that OG, and they described me as being an OG member of the IA community, and I stopped them in their tracks and I was like, I want to remind you that I met you when I was in my 20s and I was shaking because I was so nervous about asking a question. So I think it's interesting that like if you do have those relationships for long enough, I think they do even out into that peer mentorship. And I would say that almost every one of those people now in my life is in that category where they are in the peer category, where several of them have reached out to me in the last several years when things have gotten so tumultuous about like, how am I handling these things? How am I making these decisions? And so that's been really interesting. There's a lot of like past me freaking the heck out over it, like people that I read the blogs of that I never thought I would even know. And now 15 years later, like they write me an email and they're like, hey, I'm dealing with this situation. Can I grab 30 minutes on your calendar? I'm just like, yeah, that's awesome. Yes, please. But that's also like a real illustration of pay it forward. I feel like I was given a lot of time and energy from people at a time when they didn't have to give that to me. There was no incentive for them to give it to me other than someone gave it to them and it got them to there. And so I try to just, continue that vibe forward. And I feel that, like I think I had most recently, someone who I mentored was name dropped to me in a conversation, and this person was like so excited about something that they made, and I remember that person as a student, and I was like, this is so exciting. And I kept my mouth shut. You don't need to do that, but it was so fun to like, oh man, that does happen, so I'm getting into that period now where the people that I mentored are now becoming my peers, and reconnecting with those folks, and like, I don't know, in a lot of cases I've become very I'm on their Christmas card lists, and, sending them pictures of my kid and stuff, so that stuff really matters.
The experience that you're sharing now kind of, I would kind of almost disagree with the statement Alfie made earlier, which was about there has to be an equal exchange. Because I think very on point for any type of human relationship, the give and take is truly never 50-50. And I think or maybe even some of the give and take isn't as tangible for one person as it is for the other. And kind of also stepping into any relationship, peer mentorship relationship, whatever it is, into knowing that maybe you will be taking more than you give. And when you're on the other side, kind of knowing, like you said, it's more of a paying it forward mindset that you have, and knowing that it will be, trusting that it will be returned one day.
Yeah, that energy exchange is not in every moment equal. And I think that is an important distinction, which I doubt that Alfie like meant it as
No,
that,
of
but
course.
I feel like the idea of like, for example, there's been I've gone through a very difficult season in the last couple of months with a lot of personal challenges, and like there's definitely been times where Alfie and I have had a conversation where like we're an hour and 15 minutes into our hour long check-in and we've only talked about me, and it feels very uneven in that moment. And I've even had these moments where I'm like, dude, I'm so sorry, like I just blew through that entire thing and it's been all about me. And every single time it's been like, well, no, because like, remember 3 times ago and it was all about him the entire time. So
Yeah.
I feel like it's, and when I look back on like those early mentorship relationships in my life, especially, it was like they were giving me time and they were giving me attention and feedback. And then I was giving them a lot of volunteerism. You know, I was the person who organized the t-shirt contest for the Information Architecture Institute's conference. And I would do like, oh, do you need somebody to make a spreadsheet for tracking that thing for members? Sure, I'll do that thing. So I feel like there's like the even exchange of energy isn't about like importance or level. It's more about like making sure that both parties feel recognized and valued, and that it's not like a vampire type of situation.
Of course.
Right? Because we've all had energy vampires. Yeah. There's like, you know, and we don't want that.
It kind of comes back to you guys speaking about having a lot of self-awareness, because like you said, the exchange won't necessarily be equal in every moment. And I think if you are the mentee in the traditional sense, you probably are firstly a lot more hungry for engagement of a certain person at some type of level of knowledge and experience. It's a lot easier for someone in that position to see value in that relationship than it probably is for someone who is the mentor to see value in the relationship if they're more of the giver. But if there's like, again, a little bit of self-awareness, the value is probably not as tangible. But also giving in itself, there's a lot of value in transferring your knowledge and experience to someone else and contributing to someone else's development. That in itself holds a lot of value.
Yeah, totally. I feel like early on I had a lot of people like in my mentoring relationships like give me things. Like I wish I was in my real office because I could show you some of them. But there's like I had one mentee that reached out after maybe our third conversation, and he just said, "What's your favorite quote?" And I said, "My favorite quote is dance like no one's watching." And he said, "Oh, okay." Right. So 2 months after that, we had another meeting. We like met for coffee, and he brought me this 3D printed like typographic set of that quote that he made and 3D printed for me. And it was just like a wow, it's like I don't know, like it's just nice, you know. Or had another one that in our very first conversation, because it's, you know, information architecture mentor, and this person was an information architecture student I was mentoring. We had this hilarious exchange about the word mentee and how terrible it is. And she decided that she was going to call herself my mini manatee. And the next time that I saw her, she got me this little like tea bag thing that looks like a manatee that clips on the side of your cup. And still to this day, I call her mini manatee, and she's a mom now, and like definitely not an information architecture student anymore. But yeah, so I feel like that kind of stuff matters. Like people sending me, you know, oh, I was at this library and I saw this cool article, so I took a picture of it and then I was sending it to you. Like that, I feel like that stuff really matters when that value doesn't seem, I don't know. I mean, tangible. Also the value of a thank you card is unbelievably like undervalued. I feel like it's those things warm my heart every single time. Like especially if they're not right after as sort of like a hey, thanks for the time, but it's like 2 months after and they're like, hey, that thing that you said, it actually changed my life in this way. Or I've been thinking about that thing you said, and this is how I think you're wrong. Or, you know, whatever it is. But I feel like that stuff is, you know, maybe they're just good at reading my love languages. But for me, that that works. Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy to hear you talk about this. I think that last bit strikes a chord at a completely different on a completely different, you know, note, because I think, you know, one of the things you've realized, you know, shared a little bit about the idea of the energy vampires that they can be, and sort of focusing on making reciprocal relationships. I think one of the interesting things is, when you are in a when you are in a relationship that's a give and take, an engagement, whether it's peer mentorship, a normal relationship, or whatever it might be, there's something interesting that I think I'd like to tie into that we talked a little bit about, and that's sort of like incentives and looking at change. And one of the things that's been more and more coming to mind for me, especially as I'm kind of like talking and thinking about this over the past couple of weeks, is incentive alignment in peer mentorship. Even like when you're two people trying to get into an even exchange, it somewhat stands to reason that things are a little bit less clear, because it's a sort of give and take. It's a little bit more dynamic, and so because of that dynamic nature, I guess there's a sense for incentives to somewhat kind of veer off, but the relationship stays the same. I don't know if you've thought anything on that matter.
I haven't, but I would say that if the incentives go in opposite directions, I would say the relationship probably would follow with it. Like I would think that you just described every ghosted relationship that anyone's ever had on this call, right? It's like yeah, because I mean, even if you just get the ick on somebody, I feel like that's still like a change of incentive. So yeah, I feel like that's something that I feel like one of the things that I've been taking away from this conversation, ongoing, like a year-long conversation with you, is not taking my friendships for granted. Like being more intentional with my friendships, with the knowledge that, without some of that like self-awareness and shared incentive on like why we communicate at all, that it can just fall apart, and that people do just exit your life for just neglect on both parties or one party's side. And so, I feel like I've learned a lot about that. And I actually like the idea of having a regular one-on-one video schedule with the closest people in my life has been one of the like most life-changing things for me in the last year and a half. I started doing that mid last year. I had been working in an office by myself for way too long, writing a book. And I was like, I want to talk to people. And now I have this like really robust weekly schedule of, there's like 6 people, including Alfi, that I speak to every single week. And it's on our set schedule. And, it doesn't work out every week, but for most of them it does. And it's just become this like really important routine in my life to keep those relationships that are friendships. They're not, they're not exactly peer mentorships. They're more on the like personal side, and still to keep those going. And I do find that because we've made it like more of an official thing, that there is a little bit more of that shared accountability going on. And we are starting to build some of those peer mentorship tools without even calling it that, just because of the like, oh, I'm seeing you on this regular cadence. So I'm able to kind of like keep up with you a little bit more, and hold you accountable to yourself a little bit more. Like, you can only meet with the same person every single Tuesday at 11 o'clock for so long before you're like, hey, this thing, we talk about it all the time. What's going on with that thing?
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Yeah.
What you're describing to me now sounds utterly exhausting. I'm just going to put it out there. Like meeting with so many people every day. This kind of brings me to the question I've had in mind the past 2 minutes. And firstly, I have this feeling that people, and I don't want to say extroverts because I hate that term. I hate the binary of
don't do it.
Introverts and extroverts, but people who enjoy speaking and conversing and having conversations it seems like they would gravitate a lot more to the concept of peer mentorship. And that's probably how you guys also ended up with this exchange that you have. And I'm curious if you guys, maybe you've even experienced something like this before, Abby, or maybe you guys have thought about the topic of how would peer mentorship look like for, and I'm going to use myself as an example again, for people who actually would not necessarily gravitate to having so many, not even intimate conversations, but conversations with people. What does that peer relationship even look like? Because unfortunately, it will probably most of the time be a video call or a physical conversation. I think physical conversation is probably easier to navigate for people like that, because just sitting in silence is a lot
Yeah.
easier, or like sitting and working together, and only when
Yeah.
you have a need to like share as you kind of working and
Mm-hmm.
processing through a problem or a idea comes up a lot more
Sure.
natural than it would virtually. Is this something you
Yeah.
guys have thought about?
I mean, first of all, I think it's hilarious that you're assuming I'm an extrovert. I'm definitely not an extrovert. I'm very introverted and I don't like talking to strangers very much. So I feel like I just want to call that out because like I'm not that
Mm.
person.
Mm.
Um, but I think that like, so for example, that's why I think that that's been really valuable for me because I'm not that person. And the people that I now
Okay.
have weekly calls with are
Yeah.
people that were falling out of my life because I was not
Hmm.
answering their text messages within a week of time
Yeah.
or staying active in their life.
Mm.
And that was something that my introverted self, my very I just want to be in my room with my books and my
Yeah.
drawings all day and
Yeah.
my computer. Like the idea of having any meetings with anybody is
Mm.
very challenging for me.
Yeah.
And I would say that I still have some of those friends that I cancel on, and they know that it's mental health reasons that I'm canceling on them.
Mm.
Mm.
So yeah,
Mm.
I think that it really is. I would question whether the comfort of that is actually good for a person because
Mm.
there's being an introvert. I don't like that term either. But then there's being protective of yourself to the point where you're limiting your ability to grow and be
Yeah.
who you could be, you know? And I think that that's up
Mm-hmm.
to every person. Like I identified in my early life as a mom that those relationships were falling away and I needed to figure out a way to make it so that they didn't fall away.
Yeah.
Now, having
Yeah.
those meetings every week has not made me more of an extroverted person at all, right? But it has created this structure in my life that now when I'm careening off of a mental health cliff, like there's like 6 people that really know about it and they're going to call me on that if I am continually
Mm.
Yeah.
canceling and continually showing up late or disheveled or whatever it is. Like they're going to call me on that stuff. I had a
Mm.
friend recently
Mm.
that I did that meeting from my bed and she was like, this is new. This is a new situation. We should talk about this situation of you dialing in from the bed. If I didn't talk to her all of the time, I don't think that she would have even
Mm.
noticed that I was in a different place. But because I
Yeah.
Mm.
do, that's something that she could call me on. So yeah, I would say like the in-person thing, if this was in person, if I had to make time in my life to go visit with 6 people every single week, I wouldn't do it. That would never happen to me.
Yeah.
But because it's like as simple as a call on a video and it's a half an hour, like each of them is like half an hour for the most part. Um
Mm.
yeah, it feels like it's a doable thing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
don't
I
know.
hear you.
I don't know. I would
And
be
it's
really interested to know, like, if you tried to do something like that, if it would exhaust you or energize you. I'd be very
yeah.
interested to know because it ends up energizing me in surprising ways.
I think it's almost, if I think about it, it makes me feel more that it's not necessarily whether you as a person enjoy or get energy from talking to other people. Maybe it's more the skill
Mm-hmm.
to process not only your thinking but emotions in the presence of other people, because I know that is
Yes.
something that I am not very
Live
comfortable
processing.
with.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no.
live
No.
processing, it's something I'm not
Yeah.
very comfortable with. It's something that makes
Yeah.
me really tired, and
Yeah.
that actually makes me it just makes so much sense why you guys also ended up on the course focusing on self-awareness and self-development
Yeah.
first, because maybe
Mm.
that is probably the skill you should be working on first if you want to
Mm.
attempt a really valuable peer relationship where you can
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
kind
And
of give and
so
take in an equal way.
yeah, and so much of the way that we've been designing this course is to
Mm.
meet a lot of different learning styles. Like we'll
Yeah.
have live workshops that sort of prepare you to do the work, but the work is not live processing in the workshop. We have not designed this course to be that at all. It's more doing the introspective work in between the workshops and then using your cohort as safe strangers to sort of get a
Mm.
little
Mm-hmm.
bit more
Yeah.
comfortable with the idea of expressing yourself and talking about yourself. Like we have a whole section of the workshop called talking about yourself. But we also have one
Mm-hmm.
called asking about yourself, where we're
Hmm.
sending people out to have conversations about themselves with people that are important to them or people that they've worked with
Mm-hmm.
in the past. And so I think that there's all these little exercises that are more about sending you on a little mission of introspection and then coming back
Mm-hmm.
to that like community of people who are all doing the same thing so that you get that camaraderie of like, oh God, wasn't that so
Mm-hmm.
awkward when you had to ask, you know, your sister
Yeah.
what your like weakness was or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, I'm very interested to see, like, I mean, Alfie and I have done this on such a small scale with the two of us, and then Alfie's been able to do these like recorded coaching sessions with some sample students that have volunteered. But
Mm-hmm.
it'll be really interested to see like when we have a whole cohort of people doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm kind of hoping that it's like the most useful chat roulette ever, but we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see what happens.
Yeah. I think there's just a little bit I wanted to add on to your question, Steph. But just because I think one of the things I just wanted to share a little bit about, because I think as a person who maybe not extroverted, but as a person who likes to speak and likes to engage with people, you know, we spend so much time talking, but we somehow never seem to talk about the things that we struggle with because we're always talking to people. You know, I think one of the interesting things that I've sort of found out of this and working with Abby, who is someone who is quite different from me, who
Yeah.
maybe does prefer to spend a little bit more time on her own, think and sort of in her own space, where I kind of want to be in other people's spaces.
Mm-hmm.
What this has forced me to do is to not to just speak everything that's on my mind and dive straight into, you know, live and in-person processing, but take a little bit of time to write my thoughts down and write them in a way that I can communicate to another person. Because I think, you know, going through this, I kind of went through a little bit of a slump, especially when we were doing the self-reflective side, because, you know, it
Mm-hmm.
forces you to ask questions. Well, it doesn't force you, but you can choose to ask questions about yourself that are somewhat deep and significant. And, you know, I think what I'm usually a little bit more comfortable with is just talking to a person live and almost expressing the feelings that I'm feeling, that but
Yeah.
kind of having this method that's sort of multidimensional gives you the opportunity to do that live processing when you're in the workshop, if that's the approach that you want to do. It gives you the opportunity to practice doing, you know, reflection on your own and sitting with your own thoughts, which I realized I'm a lot less comfortable than I thought, and also finding a couple of different ways in between. And I think it's kind of having gone through that full spectrum that I'm seeing that even though I thought I was really, you know, self-aware and able
Oh, we
to
both did. We
speak.
both thought.
Everyone
Thought we
Yeah.
really
No
knew
one
each
is.
other, and we didn't know. We didn't know
Yeah.
ourselves at all. No.
And I think
Isn't that
going
amazing?
into that space.
Yeah. No, I mean, it has been. It's been yeah,
It's a relief.
amazing, and not yet. I want it to be a relief, but
Yeah,
not yet.
it's
Yeah, I would.
Get
If we
there.
said we were
Still
done,
in
I'd
the
be
mix.
like, yeah, maybe. But yeah, it's much more
Mhm.
still in the mix. I'm glad that you called that out, Alfie. I hadn't thought about that. One thing that I can say, just in like the opposite way, is like Alfie has definitely reflected how much he's gotten kind of the opportunity to think in structure and to do kind of like the introspection ahead. But one thing that I've gotten from him is the ability to collaborate and get to know people on the fly. Like I'm really bad at that. And we've had a couple of meetings within the community where I brought him in to help me to be better at that, because there's just like a limiter on my introversion that makes it so I want to rush through to the end of the meeting. Like I just want the goal to be done. Let's get the agenda. Let's get the next steps. Like I'll make a half an hour meeting 15 minutes if I can. Alfie will make it 45 minutes and everyone will leave with like new music recommendations and feeling like they're going to have a coffee chat next week as well. That's like a completely different way of working. And I've definitely seen a reaction from different types of folks than I'm used to in terms of the way that I approach those things. So it's interesting to have found peership with somebody that is so different in so many ways, but also somebody that I just always felt, you know, could see me, you know, didn't necessarily have the experience of being me, but could acknowledge that I'm a person in the world doing things that are hard.
Yeah. At the risk of sounding
Thank you,
really
Alfie.
cliche, we often attract the opposite, right? because we need that
Yeah.
mirror
Mhm.
to kind of show us not what we're lacking, but our strengths and our weaknesses.
Exactly.
Mm,
Yeah. Yeah.
100%. And I think paying credence to the fact that we are just people trying to do difficult things in the world and working at it. I think it's also good for us every now and then, the people that we meet around us whose story we don't get to know and whose background we don't get to dive into, just to give them the benefit of the doubt as well. And
Yeah.
I think with a sentiment like that, we're probably heading into the closing stages of our discussion.
I mean, I'd be sad, but I
And
talk to you every week several times. And Stephanie, we're gonna have to get on a regular chat. So
Oh.
see what I did there? See what I did there? I'm like, Stephanie needs a regular chat.
Oh, yeah. But I'm really glad we got to do this. I'm really glad we got to do this. Not only because you're two very good friends from different sides of my life, but I think also because these are three minds that have interesting things to say, and many more to come. But Abby, thank you so much for making the time to be with us. Maybe before we wrap up,
Yeah.
just a couple of things. Where might people find you, or where would you prefer to most be followed, engaged with, or communicate with
Yeah.
from our audience?
So everything that I have ever made, for the most part, except for the human being that I've made, is on my website. So abbycovert.com. You can also find a lot of the information on the stuff that Alfie and I have been working on the sensemakersclub.com. I have all of the social medias. I'm not on them very much, but I do post to them when I have new things. But if people want to keep up with my work, I really encourage my mailing list, which you can get to from either one of the websites that I mentioned. Yeah, other than that, if you like books, buy them from the author. If that author's me, that's awesome. But if not, buy them from the author.
Nice.
Always.
Thanks so
And
much, Abby. It
to
was so
our
great to meet you.
Yeah, you too, Stephanie. This is cool. I think we should call this episode Alfie's Worlds Collide.
Yeah. And to everybody listening, thank you very much. And till next time, peace.
Cheers, guys.
Bye, y'all.